There's a common assumption in a lot of anti-estrangement spaces that people these days are just too quick to call their parents toxic or abusive, that back in the day the same behaviors weren't considered harmful, and that the schism between estranged parents and their adult children is merely one of definitions, that they just can't seem to agree on what constitutes harm.
Reasons number 1 and 2 that adult children report not talking to their parents is number 1, that their parents have so-called toxic behavior, and number 2, that they feel unsupported. That's why they distance themselves. A lot of this is sort of therapy speak. I would hypothesize that if you go back 75 years and you talk about toxic behavior, people wouldn't really know what you're talking about.
Our ideas about what constitutes harm, abuse, trauma, and neglect have radically expanded in the past 3 decades, radically expanded. So what often happens is an adult child, like any of you may come up to your parent and go, you emotionally abused me, you neglected me, you traumatized me. And your parents are going to be like, what the hell? I would have killed for a childhood like yours. Yes. So generations are talking past each other.
In this video, I'm going to provide definitive proof that this assumption is incorrect. That toxic parents have always caused harm to their children, that those children experienced it as harm even if they didn't yet have the language to name it, and that the kids then estranged themselves from those parents. How, you might ask? I'm going to tell you about a 50-page letter that Franz Kafka wrote to his abusive father. This text, in addition to being a very powerful and heart-wrenching narration, proves that parents mistreating their children is nothing new. Toxic parents follow a consistent pattern even across centuries of time. And the pain caused to their children, that too is consistent. The harm of toxic parents is nothing new. First of all, who was Franz Kafka? He was a Jewish Czech author born in 1883. His mother was described as a shy and quiet person who worked over 12 hours a day. His father, in turn, was described as domineering and authoritarian. Kafka was one of 6 children, but he had a somewhat lonely childhood. As he put it, my brothers died young and my sisters came along much later. As an adult, people experienced Kafka as smart, funny, self-reflective, but Kafka was convinced that he was repulsive to other people. It's speculated that he may have also struggled with an eating disorder and illness anxiety, possibly some obsessive-compulsive tendencies there. And after his death, people discovered a letter that he'd written to his estranged father in 1919 but never sent. And I think anyone who has any sort of knowledge about difficult parent-child relationships will recognize that his words ring true despite the turning of the centuries. So what actually happened between the two of them? Kafka naturally had a timid, quiet, introverted temperament. His father, on the other hand, had a very different personality. He could be cruel, aggressive to others, limited in empathy and remorse. Kafka wrote, "We were so different and so dangerous to each other." Personality clashes are definitely a reason why parents and children sometimes don't get along, but especially when those personality clashes reflect an abusive dynamic where one person is sort of dominating another. And temperamental differences between kids can sometimes explain why some manage to cope with an abusive parent better than others, or even get along better with an abusive parent better than others, because maybe they just have a tougher temperament. You know, Kafka repeatedly says in this letter, I think I would have always turned out to be this like timid, quiet person no matter what, but certain personalities absorb interpersonal domination in a different way than other types of personalities. It harms them deeper. Despite this, Kafka doesn't overly blame or vilify his father. He repeatedly says he doesn't blame him, but he just doesn't want to also be blamed for the estrangement between the two of them. He holds his dad in pretty high regard despite his difficult personality, listing off things that he admires about him. He says his dad didn't hit him much in his life, but the details of what did transpire between the two of them pretty closely maps out with emotional abuse. He says, I only remember one incident from the first few years. I once whined all night for water, and after a few strong threats had no effect, you took me out of bed, carried me on the balcony, and left me there for a while in my shirt in front of the closed door. I was obedient afterward, but I was damaged by it. I was never able to properly reconcile the obviousness of the senseless request for water and the extreme horror of being carried out. And this just goes to show harsh punishment doesn't make sense to kids. The takeaways that they have from harsh punishment is damaging. It's stuff like, when I need water, I need to be silent, I need to not speak out about being thirsty, rather than constructive takeaways like, I should find better ways to communicate my thirst. Like, there is currently a woman who went viral on TikTok because she admitted to potty training her child with a method of, when they have an accident, she puts them in a cold shower. This is guaranteed to backfire. This is only going to form a negative association between that child and potty training, probably instill a lot of fear and terror in that child. Discipline does not equal punishment. You know, we think of the word discipline and it brings to mind these like harsh punishments, but the root of the word discipline comes from the Latin word for disciple, which is just a student, a pupil. When you discipline your child, you are treating them like your student. And what good teacher teaches the information that they have to share with their students by beating it into them? Children, of course, need consequences for their behavior, but consequences also shouldn't feel like punishment. Consequences should be natural, they should be proportionate, they should be related to whatever they did wrong, and they should always be paired with love and acceptance and gentleness. If you use such harsh punishment to scare your child into obedience, then you don't get to wonder why your child is too afraid to come to you when they have a concern or why they don't want anything to do with you as an adult. Now, what did his dad do the rest of his life? We're going to get into that after a quick word from today's sponsor, Masterclass. I have been using Masterclass for years, and I truly cannot overstate the value that it's brought to my life. Masterclass is a library of over 200 courses and thousands of lessons in a variety of fields, be they writing, business, science and tech, health and wellness, cooking. It's a membership-based streaming service billed annually at $10 per month. But this is not just like a regular library of courses. In my opinion, these are the top lessons in the world, created by titans in their field, you know, best-selling authors, famous business people, psychologists who specialize in specific fields. Like I said, I've been watching their classes for a really long time. Their writing classes that I took years ago stuck with me for life. More recently, I've been watching more personal development classes on Masterclass, such as Martha Stewart's class on how to show up as your best self in business and personal life, Ryan Holiday's class on using ancient philosophy to solve modern problems, the parenting class. I also just saw a class on Masterclass about using attachment theory to build a strong relationship, so that's going to be my next watch probably. They add new classes to the library every month. You can stream anywhere, anytime, at your own pace. And Masterclass currently has a Father's Day sale going on, which means you can get up to 50% off your annual Masterclass subscription. Just click the link in this video's description or scan the QR code on screen. Learn from the best to become your best with Masterclass. So back to Kafka, what exactly did his father do to him growing up? One thing is that he would constantly insult everyone to the point where Kafka sort of internalized his judgmentalness and began assuming that everybody else must constantly think that he's awful too. Anytime he had a person who he admired, he said the following about his dad: "You went in with insult, slander, and humiliation without any consideration for my feelings and without respect for my judgment. Without ever knowing him, you compared him to vermin in a terrible way." The way that parents speak about others is just as important as the way they speak about their kids, because a parent's voice will often become internalized as that person's internal monologue. And so it's certainly possible that the child will also start to become very judgmental and critical of everyone, but it's also possible that they're just going to start assuming everybody else thinks that way, because their blueprint of how to be in the world, their parent, did this. And so they assume anytime they walk into a room, everyone is judging me, everyone is criticizing me, they think the worst of me. You can imagine how that can result in a deep sense of insecurity and self-doubt and an inner critic. The mistrust that you tried to instill in me in business and family matters against most people, name me a person who was somehow important to me in my childhood whom you had not at least once thoroughly criticized, and which, strangely enough, did not particularly bother you. This mistrust, which as a child I could never see confirmed with my own eyes, since I saw only unattainably distinguished people everywhere, became in me a mistrust of myself and a constant fear of everything else. He also spoke about how his dad would use irony in a very mean way. For example, he would say to him, "Can't you do it this way? That's probably already too much for you. Of course you don't have time for that." Or sometimes he would talk to Kafka's mom about Kafka, who was in the same room, and say things like, "Of course you can't expect that from your son." Irony is not always a bad thing. There are certain cultures, for example, that use irony very heavily just as a sense of humor and connection. The key is, if you have contempt in your irony, that's a relationship killer. If you're being ironic in a way of saying like, "Wow, how fucking terrible you are," that's obviously not going to be very good for that relationship. Kafka also wrote about how his dad had a lot of double standards for him versus his children, and how he would constantly criticize his children as well. Whatever was on the table had to be eaten, and the quality of the food was not to be discussed, but you often found the food inedible. You called it that slop, the beast, the cook had spoiled it. Because you, in accordance with your ravenous hunger and your particular preference, ate everything quickly, hot and in big bites, the child had to hurry. There was gloomy silence at the table, interrupted by admonitions: "Eat first, then speak," or "Faster, faster, faster," or "See, I finished long ago." You were not allowed to tear the bread, but you could. You were not allowed to slurp the vinegar, but you could. You, who were so tremendously important important to me did not keep to the commandments you imposed on me. When a parent positions themselves as some sort of God, who's above the law that they are setting for their children, the child internalizes from that a sense of inferiority, a sense of like, okay, there's this rule set, but there are people who are above it, and I'm for some reason not. He also narrated his dad's lack of empathy and remorse. What I have always found incomprehensible is your complete insensitivity to the suffering and shame you could inflict on me with your words and judgment. It was as if you had no idea of your power. When Kafka said something hurtful, he said, I regretted it as I said it, but you just lashed out with your words. You felt sorry for no one, not during, not afterwards. One was completely defenseless against you. He also said his father would threaten him. For example, he would say, I'll tear you apart like a fish. He would curse out other people in front of him. Both of these things are generally meant to instill fear, to make the child think that their parent is capable of physical violence, even if they don't follow through on it, that their parent is volatile. You never know, in a split of a second, they might do something to hurt you. It is also true that you hardly ever hit me, but the shouting, the reddening of your face, the hasty unfastening of your suspenders, their lying ready on the back of a chair was almost more annoying for me. It is like when someone is to be hanged. If he is really hanged, then he is dead and it is all over. But if he has to experience all the preparations for being hanged and only learns of his reprieve when the noose is hanging in front of his face, he can suffer from it for the rest of his life. This really mirrors a recent study that came out showing that emotional abuse might have more long-lasting, profound effects than physical abuse. And this is something that I've been saying for a long time. Physical abuse, the scars heal, the bruises go away, the wounds close, but emotional abuse sticks with you for life. And this is not to say like, oh, physical abuse is not so bad. Like, no, most people who have experienced physical abuse have also experienced emotional abuse. It's extremely rare to encounter one where the other is not. But Kafka's metaphor is so powerful. It's like every day of your life you think that you're going to be hanged. That is the effect of emotional abuse. It seemed to the child it was through your mercy that life was preserved and continued as your undeserved gift. You know, these threats that he's talking about, it kind of sounds like the modern day expression, I brought you into this life and I can take you out of it, which is like such an insane thing to say to a child. Like, it's wild to me that there are genuinely so many people out there that say this to children. There is nothing new under the sun. Toxic parents have followed the same formula, the same rule book for millennia. They think they're so special and so above the rules, but they prove the rule time and time again. Kafka also talked about how he felt intimidated by his dad's physical largeness as well. I was already depressed by your mere physicality. I remember, for example, how often we undressed together in a changing cubicle. I was skinny, weak, and small. You were strong, tall, and broad. When there's already a layer of power imbalance between two people, additional layers of an imbalance between them two feel inflated, kind of like they're just compounding on each other. You know, like a very large father compared to a skinny child isn't necessarily something that the child feels threatened by, but if the child already feels threatened by their parent, that physical difference between the two of them is going to feel so much larger. For example, children who have parents who are very high achievers, very successful in whatever their field is, who also expect high achievement from them, will in a lot of cases compare with their parents, and they're going to feel small and ashamed. It brings to mind this episode in Desperate Housewives where Gabrielle Solis is trying to prove a point to her daughter Juanita that she doesn't need to wear makeup to be pretty and feel good about herself. Juanita is at the time struggling a lot with her body image, and she sees her mom, who is this previous supermodel who's gorgeous, and she understandably compares to her because she feels inferior. When in that episode Gabrielle can't help it, she feels insecure, she goes and she sneaks into the bathroom and she puts on makeup. There's this really sad moment where Juanita says, you look really pretty, mom, and you can tell, you know, she's admiring her, but she's comparing to her, and ultimately she feels like she can't match up. If a parent makes their child feel inferior and small, that child will become very afraid and ashamed of that smallness, and it could even result in a lot of like physical shame towards their body or develop into body dysmorphia or an eating disorder. Eventually, Kafka narrates how he stopped speaking. Basically, his father sort of silenced him through this treatment. He says it so beautifully, I unlearned speaking. Your threat, not a word of contradiction, and the raised hand that went with it have been with me ever since. I developed a halting, stuttering way of speaking in front of you. And then Kafka says, finally, I remained silent. And this certainly happens in cases of emotional abuse, but I also see it happen with parents who try to force their naturally more timid children to just kind of like snap out of it. It usually backfires. You know, let's say you have a child who has a more quiet, introverted, shy temperament. Shyness is already born of a child not really trusting people, feeling like they need to know a person, they need to know that they're trustworthy in order to open up to them. And so if you as the parent then try to force them to speak to people that they don't feel safe speaking to, the shyness deepens because the child again feels unsafer and unsafer. They're being thrown into situations with people they can't trust and their hypervigilance just increases. The solution to shyness or a timid temperament is to just provide support to a child, to not force them to do things that they're not comfortable with or to engage with people that they don't trust yet, and to just be patient with them and say, listen, I'm here for you. For some reason your body is telling you that you don't feel safe in this interaction. What can I do to make you more comfortable? Kafka also lost any self-confidence he may have had. I lost confidence in my own actions. I was unstable and doubtful. The older I became, the greater was the material that you could hold up to me as proof of my worthlessness. We saw in his letter a proof that gaslighting existed all the way back then, and the way that it impacts a person's self-doubt in their own perceptions. I still had a certain consolation in my mistrust of my own judgment. I said to myself, you are exaggerating, feeling, as youth always does, little things as great exceptions. This so clearly mirrors how anti-estrangement people these days dismiss anything that adult children say because they're young and therefore they must be lying or exaggerating for attention. And eventually, Kafka didn't want to have anything associated with his father. The next eternal result of this whole situation was that I fled from everything that even remotely reminded of you. For example, he couldn't stand to work in the same shop as him because of the way his dad mistreated the other staff. When he saw the way he would mistreat them, most likely Kafka was in fight, flight, or freeze mode. You can't live your life constantly on edge wondering if you're safe because of the person that you're in proximity with. At some point, any person, any animal that wants to protect their survival is going to step away from that situation. Kafka also seemed to yearn for a deeper connection with Judaism than what his dad provided him, so he sought out his own relationship with his faith. But apparently then his dad also started to scorn on that, making it seem like kind of an abomination to his own form of Judaism, which I guess involved going to temple only 4 times a year. Kafka gave us a little tiny hint that maybe he had some possible OCD tendencies, some illness anxiety, some body dysmorphia, some eating issues, when he said, of course, the next thing, my own body became uncertain to me. I grew tall but didn't know what to do with it. The burden was too heavy. My back became crooked. I hardly dared to move, let alone do gymnastics. I remained weak. I marveled at everything I still had, such as my good digestion. That was enough to lose it, and that opened the door to all kinds of hypochondria. When you make a child feel like there is something wrong with them, they sometimes internalize that to mean their very physical body. They sometimes take that to mean, literally the body that I inhabit, something's not right with it, either because there must be some secret illness with it or because it's monstrous and ugly. That's why body dysmorphia, eating issues, illness anxiety are commonly found in those who have had abusive parents. Kafka twice backtracked on engagements he had to get married, and the way he describes it, it was seemingly because of wounds from his own father. All the negative forces that I described as a result of your upbringing, that is weakness, lack of self-confidence, guilt, were also gathered here with fury and literally drew a cordon between me and marriage. Despite the fact that he seemed to really yearn for connection, he spoke very highly of having a family. To marry, to found a family, to accept all the children that come, to maintain them in this uncertain world, and even to lead them a little is, in my opinion, the utmost that a person can ever achieve. He also liked his fiancés. It wasn't that he didn't like the women that were selected for him. So he asks, why didn't I get married? In my opinion, the reasons that he described kind of boiled down to self-sabotage. It seems like Kafka didn't think that he deserved love. He didn't deserve this happy ending, happy nuclear family that he wanted. Whatever unconscious beliefs you have about yourself, they're going to drive your outcomes. If you believe that you are worthless, that you don't deserve anything good, you don't deserve to be happy or to experience love, you're going to make choices that further deepen that belief. Because psychologically, we want to be right more than we want to be happy. It also seems like he had a bit of fear about repeating the cycle and projecting his own self-hatred onto a son who might be like him. Nevertheless, I must say that I would find such a silent, dull, dry, decayed son unbearable. I would probably flee from him, emigrate. And it's sad because he seemed to really admire and desire family life. It could have been a lovely corrective experience for him. And he seemed to have the nuance and the self-awareness to be a good father despite the wounds that he endured. But this is what happened when you let fear dictate your choices. You may never get to be on the receiving end of that healing journey. You might never get your happy ever after because you would rather just prove right your self-hatred. Kafka also describes with surprisingly modern perspectives the dysfunctional family system in which he grew up. His mom is described almost as kind of an enabler, the type of parent that tries to be good to their kids despite their partner's abuse toward them, but never really stands up for their kids and contributes to the problem by asking everyone else in the system to tiptoe around the abuser instead of just holding the abuser accountable. My mother was boundlessly good to me. Unconsciously, my mother had the role of a hunter's hound. If in some improbable case your education could have made me stand on my own 2 feet by producing defiance, dislike, or even hatred, my mother would balance that by being good, by reasonable speech, and by her intercession, and I was driven back into your orbit again from which I might otherwise have broken out to our mutual advantage. He also reveals why one family estrangement often begets other family estrangements as well. If I wanted to flee from you, I also had to flee from my family, even from my mother. You could always find protection with her, but only in relation to you. She loved you too much and was too devoted to you for her to be able to be an independent spiritual force in the child's struggle long term. This is so sad, but it's true. When a parent is dealing with an abusive spouse, they often must choose between the spouse or their child. Many parents choose wrong. You must always choose protecting the vulnerable child that you are responsible for protecting rather than the life partner you've chosen. And this next part I found really sad. She nevertheless adopted your judgments and condemnations regarding the children more and more completely over the years, more in her feelings than in her mind, and more blindly. I find it so sad how sometimes even a non-abusive person will absorb an abusive person's beliefs almost like as a protective mechanism. Because it's so much easier to just agree with the abuser and to just absorb their worldview blindly than it is to acknowledge, oh my God, this person is harming people that I love, and to address the guilt of the fact that you've been enabling them up until that point, that you've been part of the problem. That is something really painful for people to look at, especially if they're in the role of like the parent. A lot of people are not going to want to accept that, oh my God, for all these years, I have been allowing abuse to befall my children. And so it is so much easier to just absorb the abuser's worldview. Kafka describes his sister Vali as almost like a golden child because she identified most with her mom, who, as we know, her mom was an enabler of the dad, and the father also similarly saw her the way he saw his wife, so she submitted to his authority in a similar way. His sister Eli he described as a dull, tired, timid, sullen, guilty, over-humble, spiteful, lazy, sniveling, stingy child. He said, I could hardly look at her. I couldn't even talk to her. She reminded me so much of myself. This is such a fascinating line. I think about how I have also in the past been guilty of this sometimes. Like with my friends, I remember in college, there was one time this friend that I spoke to in like a really blunt, kind of harsh way. You know, looking back on it years later, I recognized that I was so harsh with her because I recognized in her a part of myself. There was something she was doing that I was also doing at that point in time, but it was so much easier to give her this harsh truth than it was to recognize that that was something that I needed to work on as well. But then something really interesting happens. All that changed when she, and this is the important thing, left home, got married, had children. She became cheerful, carefree, courageous, generous, unselfish, hopeful. It is almost unbelievable how you have actually not noticed this change at all, and in any case have not assessed it according to merit. So blinded are you by the resentment you have always had towards Eli. This really shows how when a scapegoat leaves the environment that is scapegoating them, they heal. Often they have the resilience to build healthier relationships, to become more emotionally regulated, to become the better version of themselves. But the family of origin that put them in that scapegoat role is never going to see it. They're going to continue to see them according to whatever role benefits the family, not according to reality. But even more of a scapegoat than Eli appeared to be Otla. You have nothing but hatred for her. A kind of devil, then, is how he describes his dad seeing her. Splitting for children is very common among toxic parents, where some children will get idealized, others get devalued. This is why we have in narcissistic family systems golden children and scapegoats in the first place. It's because of the parents splitting. She is so far from you that you hardly see her anymore, but instead imagine a ghost in the place of where you suspect her to be. Incidentally, she was the last to enter into an already established power structure and was able to form her own opinion from the wealth of material available to her, which goes to show birth order, how many siblings a child does or doesn't have, the point in time at which the parent has the child. All of these things impact the way that a child will experience their parents. And so two children could experience their parents in wildly different ways simply because of that. I'm telling you, it's crazy. Like, the contents of this book ring so true to the way that we talk about family today. It's nothing new. But there are so many moments in this letter where where I'm struck by the similarity between how Kafka describes his estranged father and the way that estranged parents reveal themselves to be in modern times. One example is it's very obvious in this letter that there's a strong power imbalance between parent and child, between Kafka and his father. And this is often a power imbalance to which such parents seem completely blind. The letter starts with Kafka saying, "You recently asked me why I insist on being afraid of you. As usual, I didn't know how to answer you, partly because of the fear I have for you." Estranged parents often lament that their children won't just openly express to them what's upsetting them or what's driving them to distance themselves. Of course, when they're not mocking the boundaries that their children do express. But as this shows, you cannot expect someone to openly communicate with you when they are terrified of you because you have previously weaponized the power that you held over them. Some parents fail to recognize the amount of power that they hold over children. And this is a very bad thing because they will either treat their child like an equal or like a best friend or a confidant without realizing that's not an appropriate responsibility to put on them, or they're going to intimidate their child with no awareness of how frightening it is to a small, helpless creature that holds no power in the relationship, right? It's not like intimidating your equal, intimidating a coworker. You're intimidating someone who holds so much less power than you, and that is so much scarier to them. I have always withdrawn from you, to my room, to books, to peculiar friends, to eccentric ideas. I have never spoken candidly with you. I have never visited you. This so clearly parallels how modern-day estranged parents are often upset with their children for withdrawing from them, but they fail to take it a step further and ask themselves, okay, why is my child withdrawing from me in the first place? Why do they seem afraid of me? Why do they want nothing to do with me? Why can't they just openly tell me what's wrong? Asking themselves these questions would require self-awareness and taking responsibility for the ways in which they push their child away. But that's very painful to do, so a lot of them instead will just say it's a character flaw on the child's part. Instead of using the symptom to figure out the cause of the disease, they treat the symptom itself as the cause. There's this part in the letter where Kafka is talking about how he's more sensitive to his father mistreating his staff than the staff are. "I assume that you had the same terrible effect on people as you did on me. If that had been the case, they really couldn't have lived, but since they were mostly grown-up people with excellent nerves, they easily shrugged off your scolding, and in the end it did you much more harm than them." This is why you can't suddenly just expect a child to stand up for themselves or to not be afraid of their parent. That scarring from childhood continues to pain them. It doesn't affect them in the same way that it affects some random adult who's your equal who wasn't raised in an emotionally abusive way. It's so easy to tell someone from the outside, just stand up to your dad or just speak up for yourself to your mom, but it doesn't work like that. This person had very real, tangible power over you for the first at least 2 decades or so of your life. Even now as an adult, they continue to hold emotional power over you because of that. But there were other ways that Kafka described his dad behaving in so similar ways to how toxic parents behave today. It seemed to you something like this: "You have worked hard all your life, sacrificed everything for your children, especially for me. As a result, I have lived in luxury, had complete freedom to learn what I wanted, had no cause for food worries, thus for no worries at all." It's the modern day way of saying, I didn't physically neglect you. You had everything you needed. You had food, you had a roof over your head. So what do you have to complain about? And also the, "I sacrificed so much for you, so why don't you kiss the ground that I walk on?" He says his dad accused him of ingratitude. Does that sound familiar at all? Adult kids these days are spoiled or entitled or ungrateful. You reproached me for it as if it were my fault, as if I could have altered the whole thing with a mere twist of the taxman's screw, while you were not at fault at all, unless it is that you were too good to me. Essentially, when modern day parents say, your reaction to the mistreatment is the problem, not the mistreatment itself. You're not seeing things clearly, just get over it. It wasn't that big of a deal. Kafka also references how his dad engaged in self-victimization and emotional blackmail. Emotional blackmail is when a person uses fear, obligation, and/or guilt to get what they want from another person. Now, self-victimization is often a component of that because it's a very effective way to make someone feel obligated to you or guilty of not doing what you want. And self-victimization is often a component of narcissism. A recent study that I just covered on this channel talks about how chronically seeing yourself as a victim across relationships interpersonally is associated with both grandiose narcissism and vulnerable narcissism, but more specifically vulnerable narcissism, seemingly because vulnerable narcissists feel entitled to special treatment, and when they don't get that special treatment, they feel like it's a crime against them, so they feel like victims because of it. Your extremely effective oratory means in educating me, which at least never failed me, were scolding, threatening, irony, evil laughter, laughter, and strangely enough, self-lamentation. You were so enormous in every aspect. What could you possibly want with our pity, yet alone our help? Again, this really underscores the tone deafness of a parent self-victimizing, acting like they're the victim in a situation where they hold all the power. And what is the effect of the emotional blackmail on the child? He begins to feel guilty and to blame himself even when he didn't do anything wrong. Many times when I clearly deserved to be beaten according to you, but narrowly escaped them by your grace, only had a great sense of guilt accumulated again. I fell into debt to you from all sides. Kafka's dad constantly gives them reminders of how hard he had it and why that invalidates any of the suffering of his children. You always reproached me for the fact that I lived without any deprivations, in peace, warmth, and abundance thanks to your work. I'm thinking of comments that must have left deep scars in my brain, such as, at the age of 7, I had to drive the cart through the villages. We all had to sleep in one room. We were happy when we had potatoes. What do children know? Nobody suffered like that. Can a child understand that today? Parents can usually point to how they experienced worse physical conditions growing up than their kids, just by nature of how society evolves to make things more comfortable for people. You know, like back during the Victorian era, they didn't have like toilets in the way that we do today. That makes life a lot more comfortable. And so a parent can then say, oh, you know, you didn't experience having to use the outhouse like I did. They could always do that. They could always point to some way that their upbringing wasn't as comfortable because society hadn't evolved to make things as technologically comfortable for them. But that doesn't mean that their child's pain isn't real or should be dismissed. Because if Kafka had gone on to become a parent himself, he very well could have then said that to his own kids. He could have said, oh, well, you know, you have it so good compared to what I had to grow up with. We can play this game for generation after generation after generation, but it's moronic. Experiencing greater comfort due to technological or socioeconomic advances does not invalidate a person's emotional needs or pain. Just the same, when modern-day parents try to dismiss their children's complaints about how they're treating them emotionally because of what they experienced growing up, it's manipulative. It's hard to argue with someone who's framing themselves as a victim. That's why they do it. Such stories could have been an excellent tool under different circumstances. They could have encouraged and strengthened the children to survive the same hardships and deprivations that their father had gone through, but you didn't want that at all. This is a really good point. You know, Kafka points out, like, telling your children about how harsh your own upbringing was, it can be a really good exercise in resilience and learning about, you know, how tough times can happen, but you know, you can pull yourself out of them. It got me thinking about how my grandma has told me a lot of stories about how harsh her upbringing has been. And it had a really profound impact on me. The impact that it had on me was that it fostered my own resilience, precisely because she didn't do it in a way where she was invalidating me, right? Like, she didn't tell me these stories as a part of getting me to not be upset with something. She told me these stories separately to share about her own life, to connect with me. You can absolutely, as a parent, share with your child the difficult upbringing that you had without simply trying to dismiss their feelings. Kafka also describes a lack of mentalization in his father that greatly parallels the lack of mentalization that we see today with a lot of toxic parents. As a reminder, mentalization is sort of the ability to consider that other people have their own thoughts and beliefs and experiences and feelings that might be different from your own. In your armchair, you ruled the world. Your opinion was right. Any other was crazy, eccentric, irrational, not normal. Your self-confidence was so great that you didn't have to be consistent at all, and yet you didn't stop being right. It could also happen that you had no opinion at all about something, and as a result, all conceivable opinions had to be wrong without exception. And I couldn't object because it's impossible for you to talk calmly about something you don't agree with or that doesn't come from you. Your bossy temperament won't allow it. This inability to see things from other perspectives, plus the double standard that Kafka was talking about, is something that we still see to this day from parents who refuse to see their child's point of view because their point of view must automatically be right given that they have more power in the relationship. You seem to me to have the mysterious quality that all tyrants have, whose right is based on their person, not on their thinking. At least that's how it seemed to me. Yes, for tyrants, it is their purported superior role that makes everything they do correct, not the other way around, right? It's not that they have a superior role because they do everything correctly. It's kind of like having power passed down to you via monarchy instead of proving that you deserve it via democracy. These tyrannical parents have always treated anything they do as correct simply because they are in a position of power, rather than seeing it as like, okay, I deserve my position of power because I do things correctly. And Kafka also showed us how abusive parents perceive their objectively compliant children to be intentionally rebellious or something. It is a strange mistake on your part to believe that I never submitted to you. Always against everything was really not my guiding principle in life with regards to you as you believe and as you reproach me for. I hear this a lot with toxic parents who assume that their children are intentionally trying to be rebellious when really nothing is ever going to be enough for them. They demand to be in total domination, and no person can fully submit to another because they're at some point inevitably going to have some need or desire that diverges from that other person's needs and desires. And it also goes to show that a lot of these parents don't have an accurate assessment of their children and don't truly know them. If you were to ask them to describe their child in a few sentences, they'd probably describe someone completely different. They'd say, oh, this person is rebellious when objectively speaking, they are very shy and submissive. And then Kafka says, there is an opinion that the fear of marriage sometimes stems from the fear that one's children would later repay one for the sins one has committed against one's own parents. People still say this to this day. Joshua Coleman, the guy who says he's not anti-estrangement, but I'm not so sure, he literally says this exact sentiment to people oh, be careful, don't estrange yourself from your parents because then your own kids are going to estrange themselves from you.
On a cautionary note, you are presenting your children with a role model of how to handle conflict. And that's a concern. You are showing them that people can be cut out of your life. And so that is a role model. Because I'll sometimes work with a parent who will say, well, you did it, Mom. You cut out your grandma, so why can't I cut out you? So an adult child. So we just have to be very mindful of every layer of this.
And then the end is really interesting. Kafka provides what he can already hear his dad's rebuttal would be, which, as you can imagine, is a rejection of any responsibility or guilt and saying, you're just blaming me for everything that goes wrong in your life instead of taking responsibility, which is the exact same thing that we hear estranged parents say today. You are incapable of surviving on your own, but in order for you to make yourself comfortable, carefree, and without self-reproach, you prove that I have taken away all your ability to survive and put it in my pocket. What do you care now that you are unable to cope with life? I have the responsibility. And then Kafka sort of acknowledges that this entire imaginary rebuttal is a result of deep self-doubt that he's been trained to engage in. This entire objection, which can also be turned partly against you, does not come from you, but from me. Not even your mistrust of others is as great as my self-mistrust, which you have raised in me. How deep the self-doubt goes. He need not even send this letter to his dad to hear the rebuttal. It's already playing in his head. That is how damaging and long-lasting the consequences of such parents are. So after some point, they don't even need to rebut you. You rebut yourself in your own head. In conclusion, my argument in this video is that the dynamics leading to parent-child estrangement are nothing new. No matter how much anti-estrangement critics try to frame estrangement as a fad, a trend, a modern-day epidemic driven by therapists and social media, there is nothing new about the phenomenon. Children have always been harmed as a result of emotional abuse. Even when they didn't yet have the language for it, they still experienced the pain. We're lucky that Kafka left us this introspective, evocative piece of text because he was a talented writer, but there are countless people out there who likely would have written the same thing had they the same resources as him. Likewise, a child estranging themselves from family members is nothing new. It happened throughout history, but it's more pronounced now because of social media, because people are talking about it, and because we suddenly expect everyone to be in constant communication, and it's more palpable when someone is not. Now, I imagine a counter-argument to my thesis might be, well, sure, Kafka did experience emotional abuse based on what he wrote in this letter, but adult kids these days are exaggerating about their supposed trauma. They're stretching the definition of harm. And with that, I completely disagree. Kafka narrates the exact same mistreatment and the same trauma reactions that many estranged adult children speak about today. I'm guessing that right under this video, there will be hundreds of comments of estranged adult children saying, oh my god, this completely mirrors my experience. If you were to ask the average estranged adult child to detail their own experiences, you would probably hear just as heartbreaking of a story. You've never asked. You don't want to hear those stories. You assume that adult children are exaggerating for attention, or that what they call toxic parents actually didn't meet the threshold of causing serious harm, that what they call abuse isn't real simply because it wasn't physical. Why is it so hard for people to believe victims when they claim they were harmed? Whether it's raising doubts about an adult child's validity to cut off their parent, or claiming that a child is only alleging abuse because of parental alienation by their other parent, we have a real societal issue with believing victims when they say, I was harmed by this person, and with dismissing allegations on the basis of, well, they're young. Either, they're a young person who just wants attention and just wants someone to blame their problems on, or they're a child, they don't know what they're saying, they're being manipulated. This is a defense mechanism that happens on both the societal level and the familial level. On a societal level, we have a real issue with victim blaming, and on a familial familial level, there are so many examples of people being enablers and not wanting to protect the person being abused, rather just to skirt around the abuser. Because on both levels, the societal and the familial, looking the harm in the face would mean grappling with our own contribution to it, our own enabling of the problem. It would mean saying, oh, yeah, like I contributed to this, if I'm being honest. I was part of the harm that befell this person. We don't want to do that. It's much easier to just blame the victim and say, you're exaggerating. Thank you for watching and take care.